Is it time for a mind shift? If you don't know what that means, then join your host, Dr. Clint Haycock, a former evangelical Christian pastor and Bible college teacher of over 20 years, along the journey of deconstruction and reconstruction of faith, life, religion, and spirituality.
Hey everyone, welcome to this episode of Mind Shift Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Clint Haycock. I wanted to say, before we get into the chat with myself and Dr. Marlene Winell as we discuss religious trauma syndrome, I wanted to say a couple things. This is a completely unprecedented time. I really hope that you and your loved ones are keeping yourself safe during this absolutely unprecedented time, this worldwide pandemic. Over here in the UK, everything is on lockdown. Most of us are hopefully able to work from home. I hope you've been able to work from home. But there are many people obviously out there who are struggling, who are facing a lot of anxiety and fear and concern, not just because of the virus itself. You definitely don't want to catch it, but obviously the economic, the financial impact. And I've been doing a lot of research on the evangelical, the Christian, the dominionist responses to this coronavirus. And again, it just strikes me that they're feeding into a lot of the anxiety and the religious trauma that I think a lot of people may be experiencing. We want answers, and they're providing them. They're telling us that it's the result of God persecuting people in, Christians in China, or it's the fact that we have homosexuality in our society, and that's allowed, and God is judging us, and on and on and on it goes. And that can just feed into your religious trauma. And so hopefully this discussion with myself and Marlene Winell will help you to kind of uncover some of the roots of what actually RTS, religious trauma syndrome, what it actually is, what it's all about. And we end this discussion by talking about some of the things that you can do to work your way through RTS. And that is a really helpful thing. I just wanted to mention before we go to the chat, I'm not going to do a break this time because I just wanted to get this introduction out of the way, especially in this time of the coronavirus. What's coming up in the next couple of weeks here on Mindshift Podcast? Well, I'm going to be talking to Stephanie McKeown actually this week. She's the author of the book Raised Evangelical. That's R-A-Z-E-D. She's obviously an ex-evangelical. We're going to be talking about rapture anxiety, among, I'm sure, other things. So look for that episode coming out in just a few weeks. Also, this is something I'm super excited about. I have booked in a day to talk to Catherine Stewart. She is the author of the book The Power Worshippers Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. And I came across a quote, it was an article review on her book in Washington Post, and the article says that The Power Worshippers is required reading for anyone who wants to map the continuing erosion of our already fragile wall between church and state. And so this is all about Christian nationalism, and so we're going to be picking back up some of the threads that I was talking about a while ago of dominion theology, Christian reconstructionism, the politicization of evangelicalism. So I'm really absolutely looking forward to talking to Catherine. I've also been in chats with Conway and Siegelman. Right now they're kind of hunkering down in New York City. Obviously there's a huge outbreak going on in New York City and New York State. So they're kind of playing things close to the vest, but at some point here, maybe next month, I will be getting, hopefully, Conway and Siegelman back up online, and we'll have another podcast with them, as well as hopefully another Zoom call. And in fact, speaking of Zoom calls, this Sunday, we've got our Mindshift Podcast Zoom call featuring a guest that we just had not too long ago, Chris Shelton, ex-Scientologist. And I'm kind of hoping that maybe Stephanie will be the guest next month on that call. This is one of the benefits that you get for being a Patreon supporter of the show. So that's what's coming up in the next few weeks. So again, I hope you are staying safe, stay self-isolated, maintain your social distancing, wash your hands, take all necessary precautions, and take care of yourself. So let's go on into the chat with myself and Dr. Marlene Winell as we take a deep dive into religious trauma syndrome. My guest this week is psychologist, author, and teacher Dr. Marlene Winell, the author of the book Leaving the Fold, A Guide to Former Fundamentalists and Others Leaving Their Religion. She's also founder of a group, an online support group called Release and Reclaim. And also you guys hold weekend conferences, don't you? So thank you, Dr. Marlene Winell, for being on Mindshift Podcast.
Mm-hmm. And I should add, my organization is called Journey Free. So if you go to journeyfree.org, you can see all the things that we do.
And I think, yes, we have a mutual friend in common, Janice Selby, who was on this show a few times. And you are going to be one of the speakers at her Court 2020 conference coming up in April in Vancouver, BC.
Yep, Conference on Religious Trauma.
Yes, and so you are sort of the one who wrote the book, you could say, on religious trauma syndrome, aren't you? I mean, you wrote this book, Leaving the Fold, which from what I understand, so many people have found to be super helpful. You left this background yourself, though. You're not just someone looking in from the outside, are you? Because you came out of a fundamentalist Christian background yourself. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your own story.
Yeah, I grew up in a missionary family in Taiwan, and also took the religion to heart myself. I was a very serious Christian girl, and especially in my teenage years, I was pretty zealous, expecting Jesus to come back any day, and went to a Christian boarding school. And then when I was 16, we moved to Southern California, where the Jesus movement was in full swing. And so I got involved with Calvary Chapel, and that was all very exciting. It was kind of the Christian version of the hippie movement. We were doing baptisms at the beach, things like that, and Christian rock was getting off the ground. So, yeah, that was my whole identity for a while. And although all along the way, I was also intellectually curious and did a lot of study of the Bible and wanted to make the religion my own and not just a secondhand thing. So I've always been open to information. And I think that was what made things change eventually, because I went to college, found out more about the Bible, origins of the Bible, and that made a big difference. But then I also found out more about other points of view, other worldviews, information in psychology, philosophy, anthropology, history, you name it, the arts and sciences, which really showed me that there were lots of ways of viewing the world and that they weren't all necessarily crazy or evil or stupid, which is what I had been taught. So I would say that my changes were related to both pushes and pulls, because I got disenchanted with the religion. Also problems within the church, the church having a lot of issues and being a bit misogynist. I was unable to take a leadership position because I was female, and things like that. So I was disenchanted with some things, but then also attracted to some things in the world that weren't as bad as I was taught. So it took a few years, but I worked my way out.
So you were deconstructing in a way. You were having these conflicting sort of the cognitive dissonance. It sounds like, wait a minute, this isn't necessarily what I was raised to believe. Now I'm being exposed to other points of view. We hear about that kind of stuff. Someone goes off to college, and for the first time, they are confronted with science, and they're taught, wait a minute, the Earth is 6,000 to 10,000 years old. Yep. And suddenly some professors up there saying the Earth is billions of years old, and there's fossils, and whoa, wait a minute. This does not fit my preconceived criteria here. It can have a moment of serious dissonance. Right.
And it was always important to me to be intellectually honest. And I'd say that the big reason for finally leaving the faith was just personal integrity. I wasn't willing to just try to fool myself any longer. And I tried, I tried to make the religion work for a long time because it was emotionally important to me. And letting go of Jesus, who was, I had this personal, deep relationship with, to realize that he was actually an imaginary friend was pretty difficult.
Pretty shocking. Pretty shaking. Yeah. So our backgrounds, we have some overlap because I wasn't raised in a missionary family, but I was raised in a fundamentalist Christian home in Seattle area. And for a long time when I was older, I went to Calvary Chapel in Seattle, which was a plant from what you're talking about. Chuck Smith, wasn't that? He was the guy that started the Calvary Chapel movement out of Southern California. So I studied Chuck Smith. I used to listen to him on the
Mm-hmm.
radio every day with his
Mm-hmm.
sermons. So yeah, there's an interesting parallel we have. Even though you
Wow.
were in Southern California and I was in Seattle, it's funny how these movements they spread all over the country and all over the world, don't they? So it's a pervasive thing.
Wow. Yeah, and Chuck Smith was a very powerful person.
Oh yeah. I like I said, I used to listen to his sermons daily on the radio. I used to take my lunch when I was working in construction in Seattle, and I would time it by what time. I knew what time it was because his show came on from 11:30 to 12 every day. So we'd stop and have our lunch, and I'd listen to Chuck Smith sermons while having my lunch. So yeah, the
Wow.
indoctrination is unbelievable. But of course,
Yeah.
I was all in it as you were. I was a firm believer. I went on into, Bible college, seminary. I was a pastor, a teacher. Yeah, I spent
Wow.
most of my adult life either in some sort of full-time ministry, preaching, teaching. So yeah, it's something very difficult to disentangle yourself from, isn't it?
Yeah, especially if it's your employment too.
Yeah, absolutely. And in my case, I was lucky in a sense that I was laid off basically from my job over here. I was teaching at Bible college in the UK, and I got laid off. And now I see that they did me a favor, although, as you say, that was my main employment for about 8 years. It hurt at the time, but now I look back, I think, man, they actually did me kind of a favor because I was already questioning, like you're saying, some of the doctrines and dogmas, and I was supposed to be teaching it, and I was having increasing problems with it. So, yeah, there's a cognitive dissonance and all the rest of it. It can be very difficult to maintain that. It's very exhausting, I think, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a lot of work.
Yeah, it is. So was that what led you to study this realm of religious trauma syndrome coming out of your own background? Because, I mean, everything you described doesn't sound like it was traumatic and difficult. A lot of people have those same kind of experiences. They question things, they deconstruct, they go, you know what, there's nothing here, and I walk away, and that's kind of the end of it. You talk about, in some cases, you could look at it and say, well, it's no more difficult, people would think, than, someone giving up their belief in Santa Claus. Yeah, well, I don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. He's a figment of my imagination. He doesn't exist. Now I'm an adult. Move on. Where's the trauma part coming into that whole picture?
Well, I have heard that before many times, of course, the analogy to Santa Claus. And, what's the big deal? I think the big deal is that your whole sense of reality is overturned. That kind of faith, and I'm talking about, a fundamentalist faith that involves everything in your life. It defines everything, defines who you are. People consider themselves Christians more than they are individuals. And it defines what you do with your life. You're looking for God's will instead of learning to think for yourself and make decisions and take responsibility. It defines how you see other people, which is mostly as objects. They're either objects of conversion or objects of fellowship or objects of temptation, but you don't really relate to people as normal human beings. It affects your relationship to the world, which is seen as a dangerous place, a domain of Satan, and you're just going to survive it and try to save other people, but then your real life is going to be in the next life. This is just a blink in time, and so you don't know how to enjoy this life. What else? It changes your view of death and the afterlife, of course. But basically, everything is different in unloading a religious belief system like this, and so you have to question and take apart and then reconstruct and rebuild all of those things. And it's a massive job. And I think it's more or less traumatic depending on various factors. I started using the word religious trauma some years ago, even after I wrote the book, actually, when I was realizing how deep it was. And as I worked with more clients and found out how much serious damage it really can cause. And sexually, too, that's another area of there's a lot of delayed development because you're in this cocoon and you're not learning things about thinking for yourself, respecting your own feelings, trusting your own inner resources, appreciating your body, learning how to be social with people in a normal way, treating relationships in healthy ways. So there's a lot that you have to learn. And then there's also the emotional turmoil of grieving this loss. If it was like a personal relationship to you, it's like a divorce or like a death in the family. There's a lot of grief. So for some people, it can be debilitating. And so I was seeing clients that were severely depressed, saying that they couldn't get out of bed or, just couldn't function. People not being able to work and having relationships come apart. So it depends. And trauma is partly your response to the situation. And that means, temperamentally, what's your personality like? And I find that people that are really sensitive and who feel deeply and take things really seriously, who generally were more committed to the religion, are the ones that are more traumatized and hurt the most when they've lost it. Mm. So it can be traumatic that way. And also your support system. How does your family react? Do you get booted out of your family? Do you lose all your friends? That was your whole social life based on the church? Are you now feeling like you're all alone in the world and feeling like a little kid? People say they feel like a child in the world. And it's very scary because they were taught that the world is dangerous, that life is dangerous.
Demons literally under every rock, as it were.
Yeah.
But it's true. We were taught, prayed spiritual warfare and all the rest of it.
Spiritual warfare. The world
Satan's
is
out to get you. Yeah,
the world
literally.
Is a battle. And, imagery is really important. Our brains understand imagery really strongly. So if you think that life is a war, the world is a battleground, how does that affect you? And not everybody sees life like that. You can see life as a journey, as a school, as an adventure, as a playground. There are a lot of other metaphors, but
more positive ones.
Yeah.
Than Satan prowling around like a roaring lion, seeking whom he may devour. I mean, that's a verse right out of the Bible, the New Testament. If that's your adversary out there.
Right. And if those are the images that you were given as a child, and hellfire, I mean, that's an image. That's not just an idea. And if these are the things that you learned as a child, and also learning that you're basically bad and wrong and incapable and empty, those are the things that are attributed to sinners, normal human beings, then those are very, very deep assumptions.
Yeah, worldview level stuff, aren't we talking about?
Yeah, those are core assumptions that you're living by. You were taught these things as a small child before you really had any defense. Your brain is not developed at age 4, 5, 6, when a lot of people talk about converting. That's kind of crazy to think that a child that age can embrace a religion like this. But kids do, because they can get the basic ideas, and in their little minds, they'll conform, because kids need to be dependent on their parents and authority. So they do conform. So you grow up with all these ideas and these deep assumptions that affect you, a lot of them subconsciously, right? So even when you've intellectually rejected a lot of the religion, you're still stuck emotionally. And that's a whole different matter. So that's what I'm calling it trauma. I mean, some of these memories might even be implicit memories. You don't even remember being taught about hell, but you still have that fear. And so, it's traumatic. Other people that, had a different personality or a different kind of more supportive family, or a church that was a little bit less on hammering in the hellfire and brimstone. Maybe they went to church every Sunday because their parents made them, and that was it. They didn't go to youth group or prayer meeting.
All in, yeah. They
can more easily walk away and say, I don't believe that anymore, and at the age of 18 or 20, and just say, okay, I'm done with that. And that's great. That's great. They still might have some issues. They aren't necessarily as traumatized. So I think we have to view this whole thing as a range of religious harm. Yeah, when I started talking about religious trauma, that was when I was really acknowledging how deep it could go, and that we've had to see it that way. I've even called it terrorism, because I think, the definition of terrorism is when you're presented with something that's life-threatening and you're in a helpless position. And isn't that what it is when you tell a child about hell, or even the rapture? The rapture is terrifying.
It is.
So, this religion and other religions too, I think any fundamentalist religion uses terror.
They can. Yeah, the psychology of it, the conversion experience, as it were. You present the person this scenario as you describe. This is going to be your fate unless you embrace the salvation that I'm offering, whatever that might be. or the solution that this messianic cult figure, whoever it can be. It makes me think how pervasive the religion can be, because as you describe it, it makes me think, okay, even the most seemingly benign church or religion or group does affect us on incredibly deep levels, doesn't it? That's what you're saying, from what I understand. And when you walk away from that, it's not just, hey, intellectually I switch off and now I'm not a Christian or a Jehovah's Witness or a Scientologist anymore. There's all these levels and roots that go so deep that we have to work our way down into all that and disentangle ourselves from everything.
And even things like what Valerie Tirico calls mental hygiene, habits of thought like black and white thinking, or being judgmental, or being helpless in our decision making. We have ways of thinking, or repressing your feelings, not respecting your own feelings, or attitudes towards your body. We have a lot that's left over that's not even about the doctrines.
Well, maybe we should take a step back and define it. We've been talking about RTS, religious trauma syndrome. Can you define it? Can you give us sort of a thumbnail sketch of what actually it is as you define it in your books and articles?
Okay, well, like I said, my book was written in 1994, which is kind of interesting because it's pretty old and it's still selling. In fact, last year it sold more than ever, which is so interesting.
That's a good sign. Must have hit a nerve for sure.
Yeah, it's still the only real self-help book like it. And I mean, there are a lot of memoirs and a lot of books that analyze or bash religion. But anyway, I really thought that a lot of therapists would jump on the bandwagon and write books like that. But there's still such a taboo and even a fear among even mental health people that, you can't do that. You have to respect religion and you have to help people use their religion in a positive way and things like that they talk about in graduate school. So that hasn't happened. But when I first wrote it, I wasn't really talking so much about trauma. I was just talking about religious harm. And then after that, I like I said, I realized that it was deeper and broader than I even thought when I started working with so many people, and not just evangelical Christians, but ex-Mormons and ex-Jehovah's Witnesses and on down the line. So it eventually looked like a pattern with a lot of symptoms that were similar across people. And that's what a syndrome is, basically, is a collection of symptoms.
Yeah, shared experiences and everything. Yeah.
Yeah. And so then I talked to colleagues and debated different terms for it and came up with religious trauma syndrome because I was calling it religious trauma by then. This was like in 2011. And then in 2011, I published the first series of 3 articles in the British Journal of Behavioral and Cognitive Psychology, actually. So that was also online and started getting read. So people started using the term. And I think having a name for something is a really big step. I was just looking for a name so that I could discuss it with people and discuss it with clients as a real thing, And I think, that's happened with other things too, like eating disorders, anorexia. That was never a word, even 50, 60 years ago, or bulimia, or even the way alcoholism is recognized as a disease. But having a name makes people feel like they're not alone, they're not making it up, they're not crazy, and it also encourages the development of treatment and education, training for professionals. Yeah. So just having a label does that. And so I pretty immediately started getting mail from people that were gratified to have a name and saying, wow, kind of a eureka moment. I'm not alone.
This is what's wrong with me.
And I'm
finally.
And I'm crazy. And I still say that to people. This is not about diagnosis. And people always say, do you want to get this into the DSM? Maybe, but it's really a form of PTSD or complex PTSD. And it's not so much about diagnosis as it is a recognition of the reality of it, so that you can go about it in working through the treatment and the personal growth that's necessary. Not all of it is so easily fit into mental health categories. Like there's a lot of delayed development. I was mentioning different areas of that. delayed development, and then there is the real trauma. So like I said, it's really a range of things. But the main thing is to have people recognize that it's real, and for the society to recognize that it's real too, and the mental health community.
I was going to ask you about that. Yeah, that was my next question. Do you find that therapists have a hard time recognizing RTS? Because part of the thing is that religion itself, they don't want to kind of go into that domain. You know, it's like, oh, religion is a good thing. It's a helpful, people get a lot out of it. And then we don't want to talk about the potential negatives attached to religion or your beliefs. So we'll just kind of leave that alone. Is that one of the stigmas perhaps against RTS by therapists?
Yeah, there's a lot of ignorance and there's a lot of resistance to looking at it because, well, therapists are also people and they have their own fears for their own souls, you know. I really think that they worry about treading into this territory. And then there's also this feeling that in graduate programs, for example, when they go over cultural differences and diversity in their training, religion is considered part of that. You know, you respect a person's beliefs. And if anything, they might work to help somebody use their beliefs in a positive way, like to conceive of God as a loving God and get away from the punitive view so that they can use God as a resource. Or talking about spirituality a little more broadly. And some therapies are very big on what they call spiritual aspects of personal growth. And then in our culture generally, it's kind of a taboo subject to get into. Like,
don't talk about religion and politics. Those are the two big ones, aren't they? You don't go there.
Yeah, you don't go there. Causes too much conflict. And there is this general assumption that religion's generally good for you, or at least harmless, at least benign. And people have a right to their own beliefs. Whatever makes you sleep at night, you know, it's an individual thing. Basically, a lack of recognition of the possible harms. And for therapists, I think they worry that they're stepping into ethical questions, ethical territory of messing with people's beliefs. You know,
it's a big one. Yeah, people get very defensive too, potentially, don't they? Don't question my beliefs. It's what I believe is the truth. That's what I was raised to believe. Yeah. So now you're messing with my beliefs.
The problem is that when people do bring up their religion on their own, and by the way, it's also not generally part of the intake process where therapists will, you know, go through an interview with a new client about their past, you know, talking about their family upbringing and their education and their career and everything that they do in the way of history. They generally just skip the religious section, right? And so it's kind of up to the individual client to bring it up and say, I'm having problems with my religion, or my religion taught me this and it's causing me. And then what they often face is a lack of understanding on the part of the therapist, because they haven't looked at it that way and they haven't studied that. And then the client is forced to do a lot of educating the therapist. So I get these complaints, you know, or people that come to me and say, finally, somebody knows what I'm talking about and isn't going to make me do all the educating.
Right. I had that similar conversation with a grief therapist we were talking about, because we've gone through a lot of stuff in the last couple of years. We've lost about 10 people, family members, close friends. Quite shocking. A lot of people have died. And we were doing some therapy, and I started talking to this woman about religious trauma syndrome. She'd never heard of it, never even heard of the term. She said, what's that? What's RTS? What are you talking about? You know, so I agree that I had to educate her. I actually pointed her toward your article, you know, on RTS, because I think you should probably be up on this, because you're a grief therapist, you're a counselor, this is what you do. People are going to be coming to you talking about their issues from their religious background, potentially, you know. So yeah, that definitely is a thing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a real problem. Although there is more and more interest. I get a lot of questions from graduate students, actually, people studying psychology or wanting to go into psychology, asking where they can get more information, more training, that kind of thing. So there's a growing interest. And also in academic circles, there's more investigation, more writing about religious trauma. You know, what is it? Is there such thing? So it's getting there. like I said, it's not in the DSM, but more people are recognizing it very gradually in the professional community.
Mm-hmm.
And
Well,
Janice is trying right now with the conference. She's trying to get continuing education credits.
Right.
For people attending the conference.
Why not?
But getting some resistance.
Some pushback.
Yeah.
Wow, that's unbelievable. Well, one of the things that really helps me, and I've used this in other podcasts and talking to people, you talk about RTS being kind of a double whammy. One of the aspects to it is you're suffering the trauma while you're in the religion, even though you might not recognize it. And then on the back end, when you leave it, there's the loss of the social networks, there's the loss of community, the loss of your faith, your whole worldview is gone. And so there's another unseen double whammy on the back end of this whole thing as well. So that kind of rounds out the picture, doesn't it? You've got abuse and trauma while you're in the system, and after you leave it as well. Yeah.
And the transition can be very, very painful and very difficult. It can be very quick or it can take a while, but nevertheless, it's a huge life transition.
Mm-hmm.
So that's why I say it's like a combination of PTSD and complex PTSD, which is referring to the continual harm of something that's occurring.
Well, reading through your article, one thing really jumped out. You talk about some of the factors that contribute to a person suffering RTS, and one of the things you said was a cycle of abuse. And I was thinking when I read that sentence, I thought, oh, she's talking about someone who was abused by a pastor, a priest, a cult leader, or something like that. But you were actually talking about this relationship with an abusive deity. And that really jumped out at me. I thought, okay, here's a classic example of how dysfunctional, for example, evangelical Christianity can be. And I resonated with what you talked about, in that God is punishing us, but we're expected to love him. It's very much like an abusive human relationship where someone's abusing the partner and then turning around and expecting him or her to love them. And yet it's really dysfunctional, and it's very messed up. Can you comment on that whole dynamic?
Well, it's crazy making, because you end up with a very skewed attributional system where you're attributing all the problem to yourself, which is exactly what happens in domestic violence.
It's my fault. Yeah.
And every time there's abuse happens, the abuser claims that they were provoked, right?
See what you made me do?
Yeah.
That kind of thing. I had to beat her. Of course I did.
So then the person has to be more obedient, more conforming, more in alignment with what the abuser wants. If you think of God as an entity, and the believer totally believes that they're dealing with a real entity.
Oh, yeah. And God is real. Absolutely.
So it is a real relationship, even though it's imaginary. And there are all these rules for having this relationship. You first of all have to acknowledge that you're bad and needing saving, right? And that God had to do this enormous thing of killing his son in order to forgive you, as if you needed crucifixion.
He took our place. That's the Christian theology, isn't it?
Yeah.
The Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. Yep.
Yeah. So in essence, God had to die because you're so terrible and should be killed.
And
this
go to
is
hell.
That children get. You're so bad, God had to die. What?
What are we talking about?
So then you're only able to survive or be alive or be a good person if you accept this deal, this atonement. And then you have to be hugely grateful, right?
You have to love him.
You can't just hear about sacrificing his son and say, okay, whatever.
Yeah, I accept it intellectually. Yeah.
No, you have to be grateful, and then you have to conform to the lifestyle that's prescribed there, right? You can't just carry on with your sinful ways.
Yeah, you have to change then. Yeah, it's all about sanctification and becoming a better person, becoming like Christ.
Yeah.
The goal of Christianity.
And it's be perfect as Christ is perfect, right?
You shall be perfect.
It's not free. It's not a free deal. Salvation, I wrote a little article about this. Salvation is not free. After that, you have to conform and toe the line. And of course, the church leaders are going to tell you what that means and shame you when you're not doing the right thing. So then when you've tripped up, when you have in your own mind sinned And a lot of things count for sin because God invades your head. You can't have your own thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
So it's very easy to feel inadequate and sinful, like you're failing God, and then that can get very painful, very serious, and so you go through part of the cycle is to come back and confess all your sin and rededicate yourself, and God graciously accepts you back, scum as you are.
Mm-hmm. The worm that you are.
Forgives you for being so ungrateful and inadequate and disobedient.
Mm.
So, you come crawling back, God forgives you again, and then you have the exhilaration of being accepted again, of being a dear child of God and accepted back into his arms. And I've thought about this, even the initial salvation and then what happens when you it's such a deep desire that humans have. They want to be accepted totally for who they are, and especially by parents, especially by a father figure, and just loved, unconditionally. What they don't realize in this case, of course, is that it's not unconditional by any means.
It is conditional. Yeah.
But you can feel a lot better when you come back and go through this routine, and then you go out and live your life again, and maybe the next day you're really feeling good. And then over a period of time, you end up sinning again because there's so many opportunities, and God hates even the small sins.
Oh, yeah.
So before long, you're feeling guilty again.
And the cycle repeats.
You're feeling guilty again, and it's very confusing. You're trying really hard to be perfect, and you can't. You're trying to save other people. You're not really living your own life. You're looking for God's will, which is always really mysterious. And then you're feeling guilty for not serving his will, and you can't fucking figure it out anyway, because he's not telling you. But eventually you feel guilty enough to come back for another round of confessing and being accepted again, and it goes around again. That's the cycle of abuse, and you're never good enough.
Yeah, and it seems like you're hooked in further every time that cycle goes around, because this is something, when I read Robert Lifton's book, Thought Reform and the Psychology of Totalism, and he was talking about the cult of confession. He talks about how religious leaders control their followers. Is the cult of confession, as you're saying, you confess your sins, whatever those sins are is defined by the group, the purity codes or whatever they have, and then you have to confess them not only to God but to your other fellow members of your group.
Right.
So that's part of the accountability piece. And then people have a guilt and shame levers that they can start pulling to control you, because one of the best ways to control and manipulate people is to manipulate those guilt and shame levers. So it's a very successful tactic, isn't it? Especially for cults. And we see it in churches all the time. I was part of accountability groups for years and years and years. We all did it, confessed my sins to everybody and prayed. And I felt, like you said, the cathartic sense of not only have I confessed it to my fellow pastors and other Christian friends, I prayed, and they've prayed with me for forgiveness, and I walked away feeling unburdened. But of course, the cycle repeats, as you say, and you're right back in it. It's like a drug. You got to go back and keep getting that fix.
Yeah, and they're impossible standards, like accountability groups for young men that are supposed to not masturbate.
Or look at pornography or whatever it could be.
But expecting young males to never masturbate, that's impossible. So they constantly go through this anxiety and then feel bad about themselves as people because they can't control their sexual urges. And the bottom line for everyone is that you end up just feeling bad about yourself and have this continual anxiety. And whatever your theology, whether it's Calvinist or Arminian, you never really feel sure that you're going to be saved in the afterlife either.
There's always a chance, isn't there? You could lose your salvation in the Arminian scheme, or in the Calvinist scheme, you might not be one of the elect. So you're never really, you could be a self-deluded hypocrite and fooling yourself thinking you're one of the elect, and you're actually not.
So anxiety is and depression are so prevalent, actually, in religious communities. I read somewhere that medication levels are even higher in religious communities than in the normal population. And they have their own treatment centers. Some of it is kind of secret because they don't want to know how disturbed everyone is. like having their own rehabilitation places. And
keep it on the down low. They don't want it's like the Catholic Church. They don't want to tell how many priests are abusing children, so they have their own treatment centers for pedophile priests that they don't want anyone to find out about. Same kind of thing, isn't it? Covering it up and keep it a secret.
And the Catholics worked it out pretty well back, hundreds of years ago, inventing the confessional booth.
Mm-hmm.
And then selling indulgences. They started making a lot of money off of this cycle.
That's it. Every time we go to Rome, I go to St. Peter's Basilica, and I always think this is the church that launched the Reformation because, like you said, Martin Luther went there, and he was outraged by the opulence, and he knew it was being funded by the sale of indulgences. Mm-hmm. That was one of the prime motivators that led him to go back and nail his 95 Theses to the door of the church in Wittenberg, So it's interesting how all these things kind of start coming together. Well, I was going to ask you, too, about PTSD. You mentioned PTSD. I got a couple more questions for you. I don't want to keep you too long, but what's the connection between religious trauma syndrome? You mentioned PTSD and maybe specifically complex PTSD. Is it one of those things that's like a delayed reaction? Is that where you're going with the CPTSD?
Yeah, it's also a constant and continual accumulative effect. The two most toxic doctrines are original sin and hellfire. Mm-hmm. Right. So with the originals, you're told over and over how bad you are. Okay, that's a toxic message, and I think one thing that I have been trying to point out for years now is that ideas can be just as harmful as a physical kind of abuse. Ideas are extremely powerful. So these same toxic ideas, they get repeated over and over and over again. It takes a toll. It takes a toll on your self-worth, your self-image, your self-esteem. So if you think of trauma as, the harm caused by a toxic effect, then that's how you would talk about CPTSD. So I always have trouble saying
CPTSD. Yeah. There's a lot of letters in there.
PTSD generally refers to an event. And it refers to an event that has to do with facing a life and death situation or witnessing a life and death situation while in a position of relative helplessness. That's like the technical definition of PTSD. And what we've learned about that is that there's a physiological reaction, that trauma is stored in the body. Because when you're faced with threat, even if it's just a perceived threat, your body reacts with fight or flight and also freeze. And it creates toxins in your body. You get cortisol, you get adrenaline, because you're gearing up to defend yourself, to survive. Right? And so when that happens, you get the message in a very deep way in parts of your brain that store it in implicit memory. You may not even remember it, but your amygdala is engaged and it goes straight to your body, and your prefrontal cortex, where you do your rational thinking, isn't necessarily engaged at all. So if it's really intense and temperamentally, your body reacts with a lot of intensity to the situation. It depends, again, on personal differences. But if your body is reacting that way, you store that as this incredibly profound and sometimes unconscious memory that later can get easily activated. That's what we call triggers. And so a lot of things can put you into that same state, that same perceived threat, fight or flight state. And so you get those same toxins, you get the adrenaline and cortisol that at certain levels can be poisonous to you. And this can happen many, many times, and it can happen without you even realizing it. And you can have what might be called emotional flashbacks. That's what an author named Pete Walker calls them. Emotional flashbacks, where you're just triggered and you're back there.
Yeah, you're right back in the experience. But isn't it true?
Like if some people entering a church, they'll have a reaction.
I was going to say, it could be anything. Hearing a song or...
Oh, music. Oh, my God.
Yeah, music is a big one.
A lot of indoctrination happens that way, too. A lot of the songs are all about being a degraded being that is so grateful and thankful that God would consider being so gracious.
Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. I'm a wretch.
That song says it all. And it's amazing, isn't it? Yeah.
Yep,
Yeah.
that's it. And that's one of the foundational theologies, as you say. When you're going to hear all this worship music going into the sermon in the evangelical tradition, it's seductive because it just filters in. You're singing the song, not necessarily listening to the words, which are actually quite toxic, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
God is saving a wretch, a worm like me. How, that he's so, wow, this is so amazing. He's reaching down to scoop me up out of the muck and the filth of my life. What a picture of a person.
Yeah, but you can see how this is mentally crazy. There are a lot of mentally crazy making ideas and teachings. And I actually wrote a paper called 15 Fundamentalist Mindfucks. Because, like, for example, with this, you're supposed to consider yourself worthless and ineligible, basically, unworthy. Unworthy. That's the word that the Mormons use a lot, being unworthy. And at the same time, hold this other cognition that you're this blessed child of God, that God loves you totally, and you're great. You're cherished by God. You're supposed to hold those two ideas at the same time.
How do you do that?
Confusing.
That's really confusing. Absolutely, it is. On the one hand, you're a beloved child of God. You're a child of the King, and all these wonderful, uplifting phrases. And then at the same time, I'm a miserable sinner. Paul talks about it, reading in Romans, he talks about the wretch that I am and the very things that I want to do. I know that are right. I can't seem to do it, and I fall back into sin. And he's wrestling, if that's what he wrote, with the same kinds of cognitive dissonance, it sounded like.
Yeah, he's going through the same the cycle we were just talking about.
Yeah, he's talking about
there in the Bible.
Yeah, intellectually I know what's right, and I can't seem to do it, and what am I supposed to do? And on he goes, round and round in that very dysfunctional cycle. Well, and I was going to say, it could be the perceived threat. It doesn't have to be an actual, someone's not holding a gun to your head or a knife to your throat. I'm going to say, when I was a kid, as you talked about earlier, I was terrified of being left behind in the rapture.
Yeah.
And I watched the movie A Thief in the Night when I was a kid in church, 10 or 11 years old. They showed this on a Sunday night. So from then on, I was absolutely terrified. Every time I'd come home and the house was empty, and a lot of people have had that same type of experience where they are traumatized, terrified every time that thing happens. One guy on Twitter just the other day said he was 8 years old. He came home and no one was home. He was so freaked out. He was basically catatonic for about 3 days. He was so traumatized as an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
So that's the kind of trauma you're describing, isn't it? And you can relive those things when you hear or see something and you're 8 years old again in that catatonic state of absolute terror.
Yeah, and nobody really helps you with it either. Like they in fact, they think it's a good thing. I mean, they use fear of hell and the rapture as a tool, right?
Yeah.
To manipulate you. I remember reading a story about on xchristian.net where this guy was saying when he was, I think, 9, had that same experience where he was terrified. His parents weren't home and he was terrified. It turns out they were down the street for some reason. His father came home and the boy told him what he had been through. And the father just said, good, you should be afraid that might happen.
Shows your heart's in the right place. Yeah, that's crazy. I remember doing that when I was a kid. That's what happened to me. I came home. I think it was from soccer practice. Nobody was home. I freaked out. I was turning the radio on because I thought it's going to be all over the news. If the raptures happen, there's going to be planes falling out of the sky. There's going to be cars crashing on the roads. I ran running over to my neighbor's house, asked if I could watch the news because I thought it's going to be all over the news. Traumatized. It's so debilitating, absolutely terror-inducing. And my parents would have said, well, hey, like you said, it's good that you were so concerned. Let's pray the sinner's prayer one more time just to make sure that you don't get left behind. I prayed it thousands of times.
Yeah, people say that a lot. They just pray
every night, just every night.
There's no security. And, our basic human need is to be safe.
Yeah.
Right? So using fear like that is just, it's unconscionable, really. That's why I sound like I'm overstating the case sometimes, but I think it's only because people aren't really thinking very deeply about what's actually happening, the kind of abuse that it really is.
How deep it goes.
To put children through that kind of trauma. or worrying about hell way beyond the time of intellectually believing in it, and being terrified about signs of the end. Like 9/11 put people into states of trauma.
Mm-hmm.
And, people are thinking the coronavirus is another sign of the end, and becoming terrified of Armageddon.
Mm-hmm.
The ex-Jehovah's Witnesses I work with are constantly seeing signs of the end. And in their case, they also get shunned by their family and community in ways that are emotionally just devastating. Just,
you're
again,
cut off.
inconceivable.
Every cult seems to have that tradition of what Lifton calls the dispensing of existence, isn't it? Where you no longer have the right to exist, so therefore we are going to cut you out of our lives. And that's very damaging and traumatic. You've lost your family, your friends, your support network, your whole social structure, your community is just suddenly gone. And yet, if it was such a benign, loving religion, why would they do that?
Mm-hmm.
You have the space to explore your new belief system. Why do you have to cut that person out of your life, even if it's your family member? That doesn't seem to fit. The pieces don't fit, do they?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, another one of Lifton's Lifton's points is principle over person.
Yeah.
Remember that one?
Yeah, doctrine over person, principle over person. Mm-hmm.
Where it doesn't, an individual doesn't matter the way that obeying God and upholding his principles counts.
Mm-hmm.
So a mother being forced to shun her own son is simply obeying God, even though intuitively she would never do that to her own child. And that's another thing that religion does. It usurps parent from their own natural instincts, telling them to do things that they wouldn't normally do.
Yeah, no parent would rationally cut their kid out of their life just because they changed their belief system or they're questioning some things.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, if it's doctrine over person, then yeah, you do. That's what the preacher is telling you to do, or the cult leader or whoever. They're a suppressive person in Scientology, so you have to disconnect whatever the religion is.
Mm-hmm. That's one of the most painful traumas, I think.
Yeah, losing your family, friends, support network.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you got to work through all that, the betrayal, the grief, the loss, the anger. There's all the stuff on the back end. Well, that kind of leads into my last question. What are some of the best ways you've found to help people recover from RTS? I know that's a big question. Obviously, that's what you do. Are there some kind of tips that you can help point people in the right direction if they're working through, or even just recognizing, whoa, I might have RTS?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think recognizing it is a starting point, because to realize that you're not making this up and you're not crazy or bad is huge. So one thing is to learn something about what it is you're dealing with, okay? I think we can't, in any area, we can't really do much problem solving until we know what we're dealing with. So that's why I spend time in psychoeducation with people, just explaining what indoctrination is, what it does to a child's mind, what trauma is, so that, and people have these aha experiences with, yeah, okay, that rings true. And to feel better about basically being okay, and that a lot of the problems you're having are adaptations. You were trying to survive, and you did survive. And I use the word reclaimers, and actually I liked that better than survivors, because there's nothing wrong with you. You've survived the situation, you've adapted in various ways, and now you're reclaiming yourself and your life. So these are reclaimers we're talking about, and to come from a strength point of view there. Another thing to understand is something about trauma, to know what it does to your body, to know that we're talking about your whole nervous system here, not just your intellectual ideas about it. So there are there are techniques for dealing with triggers. I use the term trigger management plan, so that you know something about how to take care of yourself when you are triggered, and how to learn some basic deep relaxation techniques to engage your parasympathetic nervous system to do the nurturing things that it knows how to do, and in contrast to the toxins being poured into your body when you're activated. So to learn something about that, and we cover some of this in the retreat that people come to, and then we practice it. And I'm very happy to learn afterwards that people have actually applied that and used it in their real life when they've been activated. So, to be encouraged by the fact that there are ways of treating it, if you are traumatized to the point where you need to work with a therapist, that understands religious indoctrination and understands something about trauma to work with you. Another thing is to educate yourself. You're free to read now. You're free to listen to podcasts like this one.
Yeah.
You're free, let your brain breathe, I say.
Mm-hmm.
Learn about all kinds of fields of study, learn about religion, but also biology and history, and just feel free to learn and educate yourself so that you have more tools. And in the process, know that with some of these areas of delayed development, there's a learning curve, and that's okay. Some of this is not pathology at all. It's just delayed development. So you can go about learning more about critical thinking and learning to respect your body and sexuality and these things to where you're kind of catching up, learning to make decisions instead of looking for God's will. There are all kinds of, and it can be exciting. It doesn't have to all be sad and difficult. Sometimes these areas of learning, like catching up culturally. I've been asked for a list of key movies that people have seen in their lives that have been relevant to our culture. Catch up on movies and music. And I have this fantasy of having a cruise where we have just this, I call it the Rip Van Winkle cruise, where we have all these classes, like a crash course in evolution, a crash course in history of the church,
right.
All these things where people can just learn and have that feed you. Welcome to the earth. Welcome to humanity.
All the things they were denied perhaps while they were in their religion or cult.
Yeah. We're all part of this. I had an ex-Mormon say that he was having a hard time because he was no longer part of a group where they had anything in common. They had things in common, And I said, "Are you kidding me? You're now part of the human family. Here are some things we have in common."
Let's go down the list.
Yeah.
Let's make a new list.
We're trying to have relationships. We're trying to find meaning in life. We're trying to make the world a better place. Join the team.
Yeah, plug in anywhere you want, really.
Yeah.
Make a contribution to the human race rather than, trying to proselytize and save everybody. But that's all we knew. That's what motivated me.
The other thing I would say about recovery is that you don't need to try and do it alone. This is really major. Get support. Get support in any way you can. It might be virtual support with communicating online with folks, but if you can find a support group, if you can go to special events like this conference coming up and find out that you're not alone and make those connections so that you're working together. I mean, we are tribal. Understand something about these basic needs we have in an evolutionary sort of way. So psychoevolutionary knowledge is really good. So the important thing is that we need each other. We need groups. And to make those connections. That's why I have this online support group it's got members around the world. But we meet online with conference calls twice a month. People actually meet each other and talk and then stay in touch on the website. And so whatever you can find, that's really important. You don't have to do this all by yourself.
Yeah, there's support groups out there, and you might have to form your own group, which is fine. That's what you have to do. There's going to be somebody out there that's got a similar story to yours, I'm sure. No matter what religion, cult group you're coming out of, someone out there. The world's a big enough place, isn't it, to where you're going to find somebody. Twitter's a great place. I've found there's a huge community of ex-evangelical, ex-cult. I've been growing my connections with people on Twitter as well as Facebook. So, there's communities there. On Reddit and other places, you can find them. Facebook, obviously, as well.
Recovering from religion, they have a structure where if you want to start your own group, they can help you.
Yeah, they can help you. Well, listen, Dr. Marlene Winell, thank you so much. I know you've got a busy schedule. Thanks for taking time out of your day. So aside from picking up your book, Leaving the Fold, or potentially catching your talk at the Court 2020 in April, how can people get a hold of you? What's the best way to find you?
Go to journeyfree.org. And there's some options right on the homepage about different things that we do. I also want to mention that I'm doing more training with therapists, with helping professionals, because I need help with this. And so there's training available and a support system within that support group for professionals. So I want to point that out. But just encouraging. And we have individual coaching, and we try to be aware of other resources that are around, that are in the community, and point you in the right direction.
So there's a tremendous amount of resources just in your organization. It sounds like a good place to go. Sounds like an absolutely fantastic resource. Well, listen, thank you so much. I'm sorry that I cannot make it to Vancouver in April. I have to work, unfortunately, and I can't make it. But I'm really looking forward to hearing about what the conference comes out to be. I think it's going to be absolutely amazing.
Yeah, I think they're going to record everything.
Oh, great. So we'll have a chance to maybe see some of the sessions.
Yeah. Well, thank you for your work. You're doing a very, very important thing.
It's getting there. It's getting there.
Audience, you're helping people, so I, encourage you to keep up the good work.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to keep trying to do what I can do. I'm glad to talk to people like yourself. Thank you for providing us with so much information on this really important subject.
Sure. I'm happy to be here.